Hello, hello. Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of Pr0totype. This is my solo design podcast, all about Cosmonic Brood War, my current focus in RTS projects and game design, as well as, of course, the general goings-on of our community around this very large project, this mod based on StarCraft 1. I am Pr0nico, and it is time to talk about Mapcrap. If you're not familiar with Mapcrap, it is a currently ongoing series where we essentially have this event, this Mapper's Workshop, if you will, where we go through and work on a bunch of content, which may have crap-like qualities to it, and essentially we just power on through, we make some content, we put it out there, and whoever wins, whoever ends up being the best, well, they get bragging rights, but increasingly now we have a prize pool, which is pretty crazy. So that is going to conclude on the 14th of February. It's not too late to try your hand at crapping. However, obviously, some of us have been starting on this since it was announced on the 15th of January. So depending on who you are, you might be in for a bit of a problem there. But anyway, we'll figure things out. And honestly, even outside of Mapcrap, we've actually seen a bit of a UMS push recently, which is pretty cool. We had Liblung over on the Discord server start to make a map called Stop That Sovereign, I think is what it's called. And it's essentially like a sort of a pseudo tug of war thing where like I think one player in each team is supposed to control the sovereigns, and then there's other players who can like control escorts and like pay for the escorts and stuff. I don't know how it works yet. I haven't played it, but it's a cool thing that's happening where somebody's actually trying to make UMSs using CMPW units. And also the idea of like what Pr0totype has been doing, where he made a map called Can You Stop One Fraud, which is apparently Can You Stop One Unit, which I never played, but he said that he sunk hours and hours of time into that sort of thing. And so all I can think of is, oh yeah, okay, well, we got people trying to recreate some of their childhood classic maps that they like. Solstice mentioned Bunker Command. I know Mystery Meat played a lot of Cat and Mouse. I don't know if he still plays Cat and Mouse. I jokingly told Pr0totype that if we make Cat and Mouse in CMPW, he might uninstall Remastered. I don't think that's actually going to happen, but it's pretty funny. And I'm trying to think if there's been any other immediate updates or adjustments or changes, but I think that's pretty much it as far as the sort of status update of the community. I did put the feelers out for a potential invitational, the same way that we had the winter invitational at the very end of 2023. I wanted to do a tier 1 invitational. So far, we haven't confirmed interest for a lot of people yet, so we need to find out if there are more people interested, but I guess I'll put it towards the beginning of this show in case somebody's listening and they happen to be a good enough player to qualify for that sort of thing and they're interested in participating in a 1v1 tournament. It would be cool to see something like that happen, but I suspect we might have to wait for, the gauntlet to spin back up and have more people interested in that sort of thing, which is coming probably late February, early March is my thinking. So stay tuned for that. All right, let's get into Mapcrap. I've explained a little bit about Mapcrap. It is an ongoing event. I talked a little bit about the UMS stuff, but Mapcrap is not required to be UMS. In fact, it's expected that you'll probably be doing something more central to the RTS genre, more related, relevant to that sort of stuff. My thinking is that most people's Mapcrap submissions will be very heavily skewed towards the core RTS gameplay of Cosmonic Brood War. And maybe they'll have like a couple of interesting ideas sort of scattered around. But for the most part, they'll be fairly, I guess you can call them vanilla in the sense that it's like, it's sort of like ladder play or whatever. You might see some pre-play stuff, but for the most part, I feel like we're probably going to have fairly low initial things, right? So that's just sort of like a gut reaction that I have. And if you haven't played Trenches, which is a campaign by Pr0totype, I played it recently. You can find it on the channel. I'll link the playthrough to it in the description. And from that playthrough, you can also grab a link to the download page. But it's pretty cool. It's pretty funny. And most importantly, it's essentially like melee maps, ladder maps, that were turned into campaign scenario missions with like a bunch of dialogue options and stuff and some non-standard gameplay. In some ways, where there's like one of the maps is an FFA map, and then some of the times the spawns aren't entirely symmetrical in terms of like where the enemy is placed and all sorts of stuff like that. But anyway, it's cool to see that sort of creativity happening. That is actually going to be Pr0totype's Mapcrap submission. Is he's going to drop mission 6 in that campaign, and I think that might finish it up. Who knows though? He might decide to continue. But I figured I would throw that out there because that's another contestant. Yeah, I was going to say contestant in the Mapcrap event that we have right now. He is participating by way of making map 6 of Trenches. We do have Shambler working on an FFA map. He's been testing that. I guess it's like a team FFA map or something, so it's pretty interesting, right? And then we have, I think we have Biddy B working on something. I think we have probably a couple other people working kind of more silently behind the scenes, and of course myself. Working on Anad's Greatsword, the screenshot of which is on your screen. But the other thing that I wanted to mention here is that while the layout to Anad's Greatsword is complete, I finished it yesterday. As of the time of recording, I am recording this on the Sunday the 28th, so I finished at 27th on Saturday. The cool thing about Anad's Greatsword being complete on the level design layout side is that now I can focus on things like the script, but also on the factions. And most of this episode is going to be about factions. It's going to be about the Hecaton Coalition, the Order of the Sacred Saber, and the Zorthos Tendril. These three factions, one for each race, are actually going to comprise your team composition. So we're going to see how that one goes. But you can see the hotshots in action here. There's actually the shadow of the Chi-Lin graphic, which is barely visible at the very top. But hotshots are the replacement to none other than the Maverick, funnily enough. And they have this sort of shotgun pattern where individually, like one or two of them is not necessarily super great in terms of its power. But once you get enough of them, and especially if you have like some cliff advantage or such, it's going to end up feeling pretty damn good to have them in terms of their DPS. So, I don't expect that the factions will be super balanced. They might be really powerful. They might be kind of weak, but it's something that I'll evaluate over time. And I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how the Hecaton Coalition evolves in particular. That is going to be the faction that you play as in Anad's Greatsword. I don't think I'll be able to get to the point where I can implement, a version where you're not spawning in as the Hecaton Coalition, even though that is something that I wanted to do initially. But that's sort of the progress update that we have. I'm focusing more on the faction designs now, as well as, of course, the script, the voice acting, and then eventually the triggers and dialogue. But we will get to a point where we have some pretty neat stuff. Another thing I kind of wanted to do is make it so that the factions all had their own advisors that were different than the vanilla advisors, so that when you set your faction, it would also override the advisor type. As an idea anyway. So the Hecaton advisor would be very different than like the Orion advisor, which might just be like the normal adjutant or something. Although I tend to replace that as well. And then there's the Order of the Sacred Saber, which will have a different advisor than Aldaris, I guess. It's not really Aldaris, it's some other voice, but you know what I mean. And then, the Zorthos Tendril will have a different advisor than the Overmind voice, which also needs to get replaced. So they all need to get replaced. The Protoss one did get replaced, but I think the Sacred Saber will have a different advisor than the replaced Protoss one for the Divine Primacy, which is the default one. So anyway, some interesting faction tidbits there. But that is the progress update for my Mapcrap submission. I'm very excited about getting it banged out in that respect. And I'm also very much looking forward to, spending a little bit more time fleshing out the factions. Obviously, we do want to extend iScript so we don't have to worry about hitting any limits or anything, but fleshing out the factions is something that I feel like makes a lot of sense to do for non-standard content, for campaign content. So, like one of the campaigns I was working on, To Touch the Sun, it has a heavy presence of Nidus Trinity, but Nidus Trinity only has 2 custom units, and so we would probably want 6 custom units per faction. That will help it make feel a lot more distinct, I think, than your standard fare stuff. So it would only make sense to do stuff like that. And that is my initial thought process anyway on how we're wrangling all of that stuff. But let's talk about the factions more, specifically now that we're done with the Mapcrap submission update, the status update or progress update for that progress report. I want to talk about these factions. So we're going to start off with the Hecaton Coalition. So it's worth noting that these factions all have their own place in the lore when it comes to the Cresciliant sector, which is the sort of, I guess that's the home sector, the home area of the general idea of what CMBW's lore is, right? We essentially did a bit of a rewrite, you could say, to the main idea of the StarCraft setting, so that we could better imagine a world where there's verisimilitude, that there's consistent stakes and sensible scale, I would say, particularly since we want a larger scale game state in terms of what you're actually playing. I feel like the scale of what was alleged inside the campaigns by default was already out of whack with the scale that you saw in game. A lot of stuff also didn't really make any sense in terms of logistical choices where they tried to focus on, interpersonal drama, particularly in the expansion, instead of, military campaigns, which is what we want to refocus our content on when it comes to stories. So in that respect, the factions that you see here, the Hecaton Coalition in particular, they have a place within the actual universe of the stories that were being told, and they come from a different sector, a neighboring sector. and they have been displaced by multiple, two different tendrils, the Imicrenia and the Orcodi, which are essentially like, you can kind of think about all of the Zerg within the original campaign as being like, not even really being the size of a tendril, but even if you extrapolate it out to be like twice or 3 times or 4 times as big or whatever, like all of the Zerg that you ever saw throughout the entire base campaign and expansion, the Overmind's Zerg, the Zerg Swarm, that could be constituted or construed as a tendril. So that could have been the Overmind's tendril or whatever, right? You could kind of think of it like that. And so instead of having like cerebrates, we have organs, like we have a whole different idea of what the command structure looks like. But that's like one idea, one way to describe it, is that these tendrils, 2 different tendrils, sort of lambasted this once very powerful military that essentially had dominion over this sector that was neighboring Cresciliant. Like, that's what it took to bring them down as a dominant power in their area, and now they've had to evacuate entirely from their star sector to a completely different one, which isn't really the same as going from galaxy to galaxy, but it's like kind of comparable in that it's another step down. It's like many solar systems exist within one sector, right? So it's like maybe like a third of a galaxy or something. Maybe that's even too big, but like that's one of the ideas that you could think of it as. So the Hecatons came from there. They spent a very long time warring with Zerg in particular, and so they have specialized a lot of their forces to deal with like things like crowd control, be better dealing with things like fire to counter regeneration. They're going to have a lot more units in general that have fire, I think. Like the unit that I replaced the Apostle with is the Oriel, and that is a fire-based unit. It applies powerful damage over time, but doesn't rend the armor. However, when the unit dies with that damage over time affecting it, its corpse is consumed, which is sort of like how it justifies replacing the Apostle, and that is turned into the Salamander damage field as one example, right? And so this is like an example of us souping up the firepower, literally, at the power of their fire aspects and their crowd control aspects and stuff, but also like we're taking some of the more like iconic units, so the Terran Arsenal, the Apostle, the Maverick, and we are replacing them with stuff that is a little bit more crowd control oriented, or for one reason or another, through one method or another. And that's supposed to reflect the fact that they had to deal with a lot of Zerg, right? And so for a very long time, they've kind of specialized a lot of their military to do that. So that's why they've replaced their Mavericks with hotshots, and that's why they've given them shotguns instead of rifles, right? And so, stuff like that, right? So you can kind of imagine that makes a lot of sense for the Hecatons to have that. And so since they're still actively fleeing Zerg a lot of the time, then that's what they deploy. So yeah, I feel like that's like one example of what we're going for, where the lore and like the pretense for them existing in the universe, that informs their design. And I think that's something that I think a lot of faction design or RTS design in general, I think it misses that, generally speaking. So anyway, that's something that I wanted to in particular focus on, is making sure that the sort of reason for their existence within the I guess within the lore was reflected in their design and game, and also actually works. Like, it's all well and good if I design it with the thinking that this will be better for crowd control, this will be better, like specifically versus Zerg. I don't want them to hard counter Zerg, obviously. The point is that they should be able to take more favorable fights versus the more common strategies, forcing Zerg to change up their tactics and maybe their compositions a bit, but not making it so that it's like an immediate counter. Like, for example, the Fulcrum branch is not at all modified for the Hecatons. So if they decide to go mech, then the Zerg doesn't really have to treat them any differently. They have a little bit different when it comes to the Starpad, because they have the Qilin instead of the Trojan, and of course they have the Hotshot instead of the Maverick. The Qilin is like this very fast transport that has less capacity and doesn't unload as fast as the Trojan does. But when units are inside, they get healed, which is, I think, I would say that's like a considerable change in terms of what is possible. Because now you can, load up units that you were raiding with after they took some damage, and you can just heal them over time. They heal at the same rate as a shaman heals, for context. So that feels really good, because then you look at that and you think to yourself, okay, this is pretty nice. I was able to get some pretty good, value out of this raid. And, I left over with like 2 vultures or like 4 infantry or whatever. And, they're pretty wounded. Well, I can just keep them in there for a little bit, pull the Qilin away, and then like come back with the raid and they're healed. Stuff like that is actually pretty powerful. And the fact that it's faster transport but doesn't unload as fast, I think is a nice like balance where, okay, we're not giving you the same immediate punishing power if the Qilin makes it into the field as the Trojan did, because the Trojan would unload so fast. But the Qilin is also, I should mention, it's less durable than the Trojan. So there is that component to it, but it's also, because it's faster in general, it should be something where you feel, I think, a bit better about like using it for specifically like trying to do raids and stuff. And I guess like relocation in general. It's probably not a bad idea. So that is the initial stuff that we've planned for the Hecaton Coalition, and some sort of like bio about them. You can think of it as like a sort of biography, like a reason for them to exist, what they're doing in the setting, and what they are being deployed as, and for what purpose they might find a lot of efficacy, for what reasons they might find a lot of efficacy. The thing about them that we still haven't decided is like, what are going to be their 3 remaining units? We've done the Oriel, we've done the Hotshot, and we have done the Qilin. So now I have to think about, probably going to replace, I was thinking either the Ramses or the Durandal, souping up the Durandal's flame-based capabilities, or just making the Ramses something very distinct. Like, I wanted a walker. I knew I wanted some kind of fire walker, like flame walker. And so I wasn't sure if I wanted to replace the one that we currently have and make it even more so, or if I wanted to replace the Ramses for, something that would complement the Durandal. And be some sort of like mid-range thing or whatever. Like maybe it would fire some bolt like the Salamander does and from a middling range or whatever. There's options, right? So there would definitely be some things to think about. But whatever that unit is that I replace from the mantle, it will be a unit that provides some kind of polyite adhesive, most likely. Definitely is going to have some sort of damage over time to the fire. So we'll see if that's, the Oriel's damage over time, or if it's the like a polyite adhesive standard one that also happens to rend armor. The other units that I'm going to be replacing are going to come out of tier 3, and I definitely feel like one of the units that they'll end up replacing is going to be a unit out of the Iron Foundry. Again, thinking about their predilection for crowd control, there's pretty good single target options for Terran at tier 3. I mean, but the penumbra is kind of crowd control because it has the splash and stuff, but it does also deal a lot of front-loaded damage. I think that the Pazuzu is really good for that sort of thing, although it's probably underutilized right now. The Claymore can probably be pretty reasonable at dealing high damage. It's technically got the whole kinetic pen thing going on, so it's not exactly single target, but you can use it for single target purposes. I think that's probably fine. And I have said before, by the way, I have replaced the Apostle with the Oriel. I never want to remove a cornerstone out of one of these factions, one of these races' arsenals via a faction. I never want to do that because I think it's bad form, since the cornerstones are supposed to be like really iconic or significant. But in this particular case, I think it's fine to essentially keep that as a tier 3 thing, specifically for the Hecatons. So, we'll see. Maybe that ends up being like too significant, and I reinstate the Apostle, but use the Oriel concept to replace, like, say, the... I don't know if I would replace the Madcap with it, but I could see replacing the Heracles with it, even though it's not like a short-range unit or anything. So, but then, maybe it would be revised in some way too. But anyway, like I have been thinking about that. Like, you probably would want to replace certain units for the purposes of keeping the factions, like, you want to keep the faction consistent with the way that the race plays, and you want to sort of have like these riffs and meditations on how the units could be different. So that is something that I keep in mind. I think the other units, for sure, we're going to replace something on the Iron Foundry, and I just haven't decided if I want to replace a unit on the Apothecary or if I want to replace a unit on the Nanite Assembly. I'm kind of leaning towards Apothecary right now, but we'll see. So, moving on to the Order of the Sacred Saber. This next faction is, of course, a Protoss faction. The core tenet of the Order of the Sacred Saber is that you could call them extremists when it comes to their belief that the Protoss life is sacred. And by that, they mean they want to safeguard Protoss lives as often as possible, as frequently as possible, while still, of course, maintaining victory. Now, this was originally called the Order of the Sacred Templar, but because we no longer use Templar or anything like that to refer to you could say it like, you wouldn't want to refer to the various branches or ranks or anything like that using human history terms like executor and stuff like that, or praetor. We've axed all of those and come up with our own fancy jargon. So Order of the Sacred Saber is what it's called now. But anyway, the core idea behind it is that, yes, we want to preserve Protoss life wherever possible. This means that maybe we use more on the side of robotics, automata. But the other thing that we could use, and this is true for the two units that I've conceptualized for them thus far, the Adherent and the X-Status. The Adherent is simply so it's a replacement to the Legionnaire. And essentially behind that is the premise that you're probably going to make a lot of Legionnaires if you make them. So why don't you make Adherents instead? And the Adherents are more bulky, single-target warriors. You could kind of contrast them to the Zealot in some ways. They have shield steal like the Amaranth, but they have a low number of shields. They only have 20. And the other thing that they have is the old Zealot passive that gave you shields, or gave you movement speed while your shields held. So you can imagine the micro stutter step potential with these guys, where even if you've got no shields, as long as you're within attack range, you can get some shields back, and then Deathless Procession kicks in and you're able to move faster. So that will allow you to essentially stick to them. And this concept was born out of the idea that the Legionnaire essentially is this disruptive unit in some ways, where yes, it has some unmatched mobility with the fact that it can blink to units struck by other Legionnaires. But the other thing that it has that's really cool is that the it can surround you. And when it surrounds you, it's really good for like taking picks. And it's actually really good in general, synergizing with the Hierophant. And the Adherent, to me, is sort of like, okay, what if we synergize with the Hierophant like the Legionnaire does? What if we can be disruptive in terms of surrounding and we have mobility and stuff like the Legionnaire has, but we do it in different ways. We fulfill the role of the unit in a very different way. This unit requires a little bit of Vespene. It requires more minerals than the Legionnaire. It requires more time to be made, like in terms of training time. But overall, you can look at it and say to yourself, okay, this is a unit where I'm looking at it, I'm thinking to myself, yes, I would make Adherents for XYZ reason, for the similar kind of reason that I would make Legionnaires, in that I need something that can, disrupt my opponent, that also serves as melee, that synergizes then with the Ecclesiast, as well as the Hierophant for sticking to targets, as well as the Golem, because the Golem will share shields with it and stuff if hit versus, hit with crowd control. Stuff like that, right? So a lot of the synergies are actually going to still be there for the Adherent. I can't promise that's always going to be the case for all the different unit replacements that I come up with. For example, the Cohort replaces the Cyprian for the Nidus Trinity. I don't think you're going to say that that's a like-for-like replacement whatsoever, but it's still good. It's still cool. It's useful, you could say. So anyway, I think all of that to be said should be said in the context of like, yeah, in this case, the Adherent seems like a pretty cool replacement for the Legionnaire. Hapsea was worried I was removing the Legionnaire and replacing it entirely with a new unit concept. He didn't understand that these are factions, and factions are not enabled for competitive play. There will not be an Ascension-style tournament where you pick a faction. At least I don't think there will be. Maybe we'll do a one-off event somewhere where it's like an invitational or a Faction Wars invitational, but I don't think so. And even if we did, I don't think it would have prize money, because I can't guarantee you that stuff is balanced, So anyway, I like the idea of doing stuff like that here and there for like funny show match events or whatever, but that's it for me for now. As far as the Adherent goes, that's the logic behind it. And you can see that even though it's not like, my initial thought was that the Adherent, the Legionnaire replacement, whatever it was going to be, before I knew it was going to be called the Adherent and took this form, my original thought was that it would be a robotic unit, because it's like, okay, we're going to have something like the Legionnaire, but it's robotic so that you're not losing an actual Protoss life. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it might be interesting if we keep the robotics out of the Saber branch, which is probably going to be what I call it instead of the Templar branch, right? If we keep the robotics sort of like to their own branch, but the units that we get as Sacred Saber faction is essentially, you would look at it and say to yourself, oh, these units will stay alive longer. I need less of them than I did of whatever they replace. The other unit, the X-Status, replaces the Aurora, because that's another unit you'd spam a lot of and does have a pilot. In fact, it has a Legionnaire pilot, funnily enough. So in this case, I think the X-Status will probably actually be an Adherent pilot, similar, vibe in that respect. That's just how it worked out. It wasn't intentional, but like I always thought to myself, yeah, Auroras, you spam out Auroras, you spam out Legionnaires. So these two should probably be replaced for the Sacred Saber. And then, of course, we have 4 more units to replace. So I have to think to myself, like, what other units might we, replace that we get a lot of? I think Vagrants could fit that bill. I think the Sycophant could fit that bill in terms of it's supposed to be a unit that you make a lot of. So there's some value in doing such a thing. We could also replace a unit that maybe you don't make a lot of, but the purpose of it might turn from whatever its original purpose was to general sustain. Like I thought about replacing the Manifold, and I was going to replace it, if I did, with something that was like more about sustaining, healing, whatever. And I decided against it because we already have like the Ecclesiast, and I think I would replace the Ecclesiast if I was going to make another unit that was supposed to be this sort of healer type role, combat healer or whatever. It's not really healing; it's like the shields, right? But you can think of it as a combat healer for the purposes of, contextualizing or conceptualizing its unit. So there you go. But yeah, we have other things to think about here. I think Vagrant and Sycophant make sense as next replacements for the Saber, and I think if we were going to do 2 more. We might do Archon. We might do maybe Magister or maybe Epigraph or something like that. I'm not sure. It's hard to know exactly what else I might decide to replace. Technically, I could replace like the Amaranth if I wanted to, since that's another unit that you might make a lot of. So there's more options, right? But if that's the shtick I'm going for, where they essentially want to maximize number of Protoss surviving without obviously like doing less effectively on the battlefield. This is sort of the take you can think of, or this is the direction that I'm taking for the Sacred Saber. And I think that makes sense for, they still want to achieve commencement like the Divine Primacy do, but they want to do so with minimal Protoss losses along the way to make sure that as many Protoss experience that sort of holy end goal as is possible. All right, boys, we're moving on to the final faction of the podcast. We're going to be talking about the Zorthos Tendril. By the way, all of these unit concepts are available on the website now to take a look at. Only the Oriel is actually implemented, but it is still using the Savant graphic, so I will need to find a replacement that is like at least placeholder level, or of course like kitbash something out of Blender and send it over. So there's plenty of options there. In fact, I was thinking, oh yeah, I should do something for the Qilin. And I was thinking I should just grab something off of like say started.net or find something else that like I have in my database of files, and nothing was satisfactory. So I decided to just kitbash the Wraith into what we currently have for the Qilin. I do think I'll maybe sit on that a little bit more, adjust it, and turn it into an actual like weapon of war. Since I don't really I think I made it look very threatening. And so then I'll probably like kitbash what it currently is into something else for the Qilin. But we can keep the existing one mostly intact because I already have like a wireframe for it and stuff. Like it makes sense to keep that mesh for a number of reasons. So we'll probably see the current unit graphic for the Qilin be replaced with something else. But anyway, I also started today, earlier today before I recorded this, I started the kitbash for the Adherent, funnily enough, for the Sacred Saber. So, it's actually not that difficult. Like, I'll tell you what, since we're going to be replacing for the Zorthos Tendril, the Nathracor is getting replaced, as well as the Iziracor. These units are going to get replaced when, you compare the Iziracor to the Nathracor, oops, spoiler. The Nathracor has this graphic that we already have a Blender file for. It's going to be pretty easy, I hope, for me to kitbash something out of that, turn it into something else, because it's going to stay the same root idea. Like for the Zerg specifically, I'm actually keeping like the prefix of the name correct and everything. We're just changing the suffix. So instead of Nathracor, we have Nathralisk. And instead of Iziracor, we have Iziralisk. And there's some different like vowels or whatever in the midsection or whatever. But the idea is my concept for it anyway is that we have these core units. I already have a structure called the Nathrock Lake, which is eventually going to get renamed anyway, but like Nath is going to be part of it. So just like Quazeth, right, for Quasilisk and Zethrakor, we're going to have something like Nath Vorv, or I'll figure out a way to make that feel good. It might be, I don't know, what would it even be? Vornath Lake? That sounds kind of interesting. That sounds kind of like fantasy or whatever. It might be Vornath Pond, and then we'll make the Kalkir Pond, Kalkir Lake. That's probably more likely. So stuff like that, right? That's sort of like what I'm getting at. And then for the Hydrith Den, obviously that's Hydra. And I mean, it should probably be like Hydriz, or Hydrizzy. I remember thinking Hydrizzy. The problem with Hydrizzy is that it sounds like a Ebonics or something, where it's like, yo man, where's my Hydrizzy at? And it's like, that does not sound proper whatsoever. So maybe it's like Hydrir or Hydrizier. No, it has to be like 2 syllables, right? Like Quazeth, Vornath, Kalkir, Hydrith, Skithrock. Skithrock Scab is obviously just Skith. So that should probably end up being like, what would that even be? Would it just be Baskith or Backskith? I don't even know how you would what you would do for that one. Anyway, that's a harder one. I'll figure something out for that. But I didn't want to change the names of the buildings because I changed the unit for the race. So you get the idea for like the faction units. We're actually going to stick around with them. The other thing that this accomplishes, by the way, is that since we're using the same eventual model for like obviously the Nathricor is going to turn into the Nathrilisk in terms of its model. I'm going to kit bash that and turn it into a separate graphic and use that. That is going to be the source of the new graphic. That means that it kind of makes sense for the Calcalisk then to mutate out of both the Nathricor and the Nathrilisk, right? So I feel like that works out really well for the general idea of how how Zerg are handled for their factions. Hopefully, it's something that I think I can make like fairly convincing and make work and all that. I'm definitely looking forward to just sort of making progress on the front of fleshing out like how these factions work. And with Zerg, I was a little bit worried about like, if I replace the base strain, do I have to replace the advanced strain? And honestly, vice versa. If I replace an advanced strain, does that mean that I have to replace the base one too? But with this sort of idea in mind, I feel like that's no longer a requirement. However, I'm also feeling a little bit of pressure to always replace base strains. And the reason for that is because if I replace, say like, obviously for tier... maybe not. Maybe there's like a way that this makes sense actually. But like I'll finish the initial thought, which is that like for the Zorthos, they've replaced the Aziricor and the Nathricor. Well, if I go in and for tier 2, I replace like the Lyrilusk, then suddenly you've got 2 units that are factional that are sourced from the Quazeth pool originally, right? They're rooted in the Quazeth pool. And if that's the case, it kind of feels like, okay, this is a situation where this faction has like a predominant amount of changes sourced from like one structure node or like branch or whatever, or I guess tree would be a better way to describe it. So I think to me that feels a little lame. It feels like maybe lame is the wrong word, but it feels like I'm overly focused on that if I do that. But here's the avenue that I haven't thought of until just now, which is imagine another faction that isn't the Zorthos Tendril. We replace one of the units out of the Zork's Shroud in tier 1. And then we replace like one of the basic units that you can get, or even the advanced. Like we could theoretically replace like the Bactalisk or the Vorvikor, since those are a 1.5 unit. So like that would constitute a tier 1 replacement in my mind. I probably wouldn't do both a Zorkis and a 1.5 unit because the Zorkis is kind of 1.5 to me. But anyway, that's like something you could think of. So imagine for, say, the Pr0totype Tendril, which I name dropped earlier, we replace something out of the Zorkish Shroud. Then we go from that into, say we also replace like the Hydralisk or the Quasilisk or something for that same faction. Now, in tier 2, if we replace the Quasilisk in tier 1 and say the Lakizalisk, then in tier 2, we can replace something that is a tier 2, like Hydrath into like the Bactith Swamp stuff. We can replace a Swamp unit, which would be Tetzoricor, Bactalisk technically, Vithrilisk. We can replace like the Tetzoricor or the Vithrilisk there because we didn't replace a tier 1 unit, so it's not like overly focusing on the one structure archetype or one structure branch or whatever. So hopefully that made sense. Like, I just think it would be a little bit weird if I overly focused on giving like essentially one structure evolved all the way through has like 2 or more, like just more than one overall faction change when you only have 6 faction units, per faction, right? So like it feels like weird to put like a third of the faction changes onto one structure path. I feel like that's probably a little bit much. Maybe I still will end up doing it, but to me that feels like something that I would want to avoid. So hopefully that all made sense. It's definitely something that I feel like it's going to be a pretty good avenue or thing to think about, is like how to make the progression feel good, how to make the spacing of it feel appropriate. Maybe what we'll end up finding after all of the factions have 6 units is that 6 units isn't actually enough to make them feel distinct enough. But I suspect it will. I suspect it will be enough. But you never know. You never know. And in a world without the iScript limit and the other limits that we have, like string TBL and there was like one other one that I forget where we were at on. Oh, it was weapons stat. That's the other one. In a world without these last few limits that we are currently aware of that we have, I think it makes a lot of sense to think about like, okay, maybe we do up the number of faction units or whatever. Like I'm not necessarily against that. And it might even be something where I play favorites on one faction in particular or whatever. But I think 6 as the baseline is probably good enough as a general idea. And of course, I'm focusing on the Hecaton, the Saber, and the Zorthos, while there's other factions, particularly with the Protoss and Zerg races, that have nothing. And then there's like some factions like the Futurist Federation for Terran that only have 1 unit, the Phylock. It's like, okay, well, I am focusing a lot on that in theory. But at the same time, hey, this is also for my Mapcrap submission, so it makes sense for me to focus on this, I think. I think possibly we can at least make it so that the Saber and the Zorthos have like 4 faction units by the end of by the 14th of February. I'm not 100% positive on getting 6 for both of them all, or for all of them, because I'm thinking like we should at least have 4 units for the Hecatons and the other 2 that I mentioned. Really, we should probably try to aim at having 6 for the Hecatons because that's the playable faction. But it would be nice if we had 4 for the others. And then maybe I could try to do like 2 for the enemy Zerg, or at least 1 or 2 of the factions there. Because then it's like, okay, well, at least you have something different to deal with depending on the threat. It's kind of like, what I'm getting at is when we had, say, like Nemesis Stormborn, one of the things that I remember players realizing was that because we still had upgrades back then, CAG would upgrade melee attacks and, of course, like ground carapace and stuff. But the Overmind would be a little bit more about ranged fire. And so if you were having a really hard time dealing with mass Ultralisk and mass well, it was still called Zergling back then. But if it was like Zergling Ultralisk was really giving you a hard time, you would specifically try to defeat CAG because like he's the threat. He's the guy who's going to use those to great effect. Whereas the Overmind is a bit more about like mass Hydra. He definitely used Bactylisks a lot back when they were still called Basilisks, I think. He definitely also used like air. He had air upgrades and stuff, but he wasn't as keen on trying to get melee upgrades. Like he wasn't as specialized in that. Even if he got the upgrades, he might have gotten them slower than CAG. And even if he had the upgrades anyway, like CAG did, he might not be using mostly those units. So anyway, like you can still see where like the predominant amount of threat there is going to come from there. We have that in CMBW Zerg AI, or just AI in general, where you'll have the AI decided like, okay, one of them is going to be a swarming AI versus one of them is going to be an assault AI. And it's going to like differ, there's another one, which is like the sky, what is it called? Sunblot is the other one, which is the air-oriented one that like only kind of peaks in the mid-game. Those ones are all about like, yeah, they have different preferences. But I can imagine a world where you would actually be functionally based on your play style and what your strengths and weaknesses were as a player and what kinds of things you wanted to do, your personality, how you express that personality through your gameplay in terms of the tactics you like to do. All of that could factor into which enemy you destroy faster or sooner or focus on. And the reason why you might do that, one of the other contributing factors might be, oh, they have this faction which is like really good at building they have this unit because they are this faction that is particularly good into my composition. So yeah, I would want to try to contest them earlier. And I think that's interesting. That's like another avenue or another sort of like orthogonal layer for the decision making to come in is essentially like what tools do they have at their disposal? Because it's also like what tools are they using? So like if you scout your opponent and you see that he's only got like one tech structure, then you know what he can't make. And in this case, we're talking about like some of these other factions. In theory, we would have like total representation of all the Zerg, actually. I think there is an Zorthos Tendril there. No, actually, I replaced it with an Immerkrenia one at the last second, I think. So there's actually like one faction. There's a bunch of different tendrils, and there's representation on the hostile side of 4 Zerg enemies that you face right now that might change in number, like it might go up or whatever over time. But it would be really cool to like set their faction up and say like, maybe the AI arrivals for the Zerg have like random factions actually. Maybe like you've already got an Immerkrenia and maybe another one arrives, or maybe it's a Gazirith or something. And so anyway, I think it's cool to imagine stuff like that because then, okay, they've arrived. You can look at them and say, oh shit, they're of this tendril. And somehow you'll know their faction. I don't know exactly how I'll do it because the faction name is the Ograz Interweave. So in terms of like clicking on their unit and seeing which one it is, it might not be as possible. But maybe maybe there will be like a dialogue event that indicates it. And definitely there will be like recognition of the player color eventually, and obviously of the unit itself. So another knowledge barrier, I guess, for players to eventually overcome. But fundamentally, I feel like this is a really cool idea and something that I haven't honestly seen too often done in, like, I haven't even thought of trying to do it in the context of, like, basically, factions are not something that nobody's ever done before. You can look at, like, Command & Conquer 3's expansion pack. But I feel like the core identity of factions, it hasn't been applied to a game like CMBW because a game like CMBW, frankly, just hasn't existed. In fact, if you were listening to this and you can remember or name drop an RTS game that was like Cosmonic Brood War in terms of very expansive tech trees, reasonable scale without losing individuality, so not Total Annihilation and similar titles, I don't really know. I don't know what people immediately refer to as like the closest game that they've had to it, but I haven't met somebody who can name a game that is actually like Cosmonic Brood War. And I'm not saying that as like a flex. For me, it's just like, I think that means that we've achieved something very special, and I'm very grateful for that. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that factions, because they haven't, like, the idea of making like a race with like 50 units and 30 structures or whatever, it's kind of boggling to many people's minds. The idea that we would have 3 of those races and we're thinking about adding a 4th one, we're working on the tech tree for that and the technical requirements for that and all this other stuff. It's like, no, most people wouldn't even think to do that. Like, they think that having like 12 units is a lot of units or whatever. So, by the way, I have to say that, otherwise Dad will reply to me and ping me. New feature, by the way. So the main thing that I would say is, like, people haven't really thought of even making Cosmonic Brood War as its base. Like, that's already foreign enough to many people. So, of course, you haven't had that experience until you've played it. But with the faction thing, I feel like furthermore, layering that on top of it, it's like, I've never been able to see that in action, because I've never been able to see CMBW in action until CMBW came around. So, of course, I never got to see that added layer on top of it. So, in isolation, factions are not revolutionary, but added to this, it's like a bold move and something that I think is actually going to be pretty cool. At least it'll be like another layer for scenario developers to customize. For example, I think, like the Hydra maps that I've been refurbishing, the Terrans have been Hecatons a lot of the time. And like initially that just meant that they had the hot shop, and now they're getting more support for that. And like eventually we're going to have more stuff like that, right? And so, I would like for the campaigns to be able to have all of this different representation, all of these different ideas thrown in there. And so I think it's really cool. Anyway, I should probably finish talking about the Zorthos Tendril concepts, but the Zorthos Tendril I didn't even really give a primer for, but like I explained how I'm designing factions in general with the Zerg archetype, and hopefully all the other discussion about factions made sense to people. I feel like it's just a cool thing that CMBW is really cool by itself, but it's a cool thing to apply to a cool project. So that makes sense to me. The Zorthos Tendril is all about area denial. It has expansionist tendencies, which I haven't fully figured out how I'm going to define yet, because that just probably means that, like, I think that what that would mean to me is that they can maybe sustain their forces a little bit longer, and they can afford to like expand faster because their units might be a little bit better with like good positioning and micro. And the fact that they also have area denial should be pretty good as well. So the Nathralisk is a ranged unit that replaces the Nathr Core, as you might expect. When it fires an attack, it will release a cloud, and that cloud will heal units for 2 HP before dissipating. So essentially it lasts for 1 second, and it gives a factor of HP regeneration of 2 HP per second. This doesn't care about whether or not you are regenerating HP out of combat like a Zerg unit does. So this will also work on Protoss units or Terran units, and also works on enemy units. So the Nathralisk being ranged is actually a pretty big asset for it, but it means that you might want to position your Nathralisks above, like, say, Hydras or Quasis. You might even want to try positioning it above Zethar Cores and stuff if you're bold enough, and if your opponent is occupied with those or whatever. But you can sort of think about that as like, that's, in this case, it's area denial, but it's also like staking a claim to the land. So that's what the Nathralisk is all about. And then the Iziralisk is also, of course, a ranged unit. You can kind of think about it like, if you're replacing melee units with ranged units overall, you are giving them an advantage in some ways of being able to take and hold territory. So I'm not blind to that. And that is something that I'm going to be watchful of as we see the faction take shape. The Iziralisk is something that will have a modified version of Corrosive Touch from the Vithralisk. I think the Vithralisk will just get revised to have this version as well. But Corrosive Touch, it doesn't debuff attack speed for enemies, because that overlaps with Ensnare. Instead, the Iziralisk's Corrosive Touch simply reduces their armor by 1 for each stack and expires after 5 seconds, which is just like the Vithralisk case. Now they have an attack cooldown of 1, so they do take a while for one of them to like, pad up the armor rend, but you can imagine this will be very useful, not necessarily for things like Hydras as much, because Hydras do have pretty good armor pen. It'll still help with like burning down structures and stuff, but it'll be really good for Skither Cores, for Bactylisks, for Quasilisks, and indeed for Nathralisks, which also do not, they have 1 armor pen, but they deal 9 damage, so they don't need it as bad. But you can imagine that sort of thing. It'll also be, I think, an asset for Rilla Rokors, which they have 2 armor pen, so it's not nothing, but still something worth pointing out. And those come from the Zorisaleth, if people didn't remember that, so it makes a lot of sense. Anyway, the Iziralisk, I think, will be an interesting unit to keep watch on. People have been saying that Zerg doesn't have that much armor pen. Protoss doesn't have any, so I guess they only don't complain as much because they don't need it as much. But, something to point out. And so, yeah, I'm going to be riffing on a bunch of these concepts. And don't be surprised if something like that revision to Corrosive Touch for the Aziralisk happens to the Vithrilisk, and then maybe also gets distributed across some of the other units. Maybe not a tier 1 for the base game, for the base race, the melee race, but the melee tech tree, I should say. But that's something else to point out. Well, we are on to the fan favorite section, the coffee questions. That was all of our faction talk for now. Coffee is a website that you can use. It's ko-fi.com/Pronago and Veek7, link in the description. You can donate to us. That will allow us to make better content faster. And you can even take out bounties and prioritize certain tasks if you so desire, which I do, of course, appreciate. Veek also appreciates it when in the rare event where he's... it's like a task that's specifically for him or a task that he can take because he has the time for it or whatever. He is a very busy man working in the fraud launcher right now, so a round of applause for him in your mind and also in the recording. Sure, why not? But yeah, no, he's the homie, the chromie, if you will. And I'm not talking about that transgender dragon. Very unfortunate. Let's talk about these questions, though. When you donate on the regular, and not for a bounty, but specifically just as like a donation, one of the perks you get as a result of that is, besides having a exclusive donor chat called Ahmed's Arson Isle, which is 3 A's, by the way, which is also 3 dog noises. There's a lot of reasons to donate, I'm telling you. The other thing that you get is this opportunity to ask questions that I will answer every week on the show, as well as questions for the cooperative podcast that Veek7 and I do called Crow's Nest, which we will be recording another episode of probably later this week, if not early next week. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, that's them's the perks. Check it out. We're going to be talking about Myrian's question here. He asks about, design, graphics in RTS. So this is it's kind of interesting because this last question was about design readability in RTS. Today, he asks, could you discuss the pros and cons of utilizing 2D and 3D graphics for an RTS? And while yes, Myrian, I think I can. So of all of the RTS titles that I've seen, 2D has been superior for readability, for also visuals and how the visuals age. Most often, the 2D games will end up being, by and large, better looking and more timeless. There's a question that Alexhandr asks, which I'll get to a little bit later on, because it's there's another question in between it, but that I'll go in a little bit more detail about, specific styles of graphics for 2D. But when it comes to just like 2D versus 3D contrasted, 3D is usually less performant. 3D games, I should say, are usually less performant. Thus, you have lower scale. Thus, you might have an idea that we should do more detail on our models because we have less units. So you're going to be looking at, bigger units perhaps, or, lower quantity of them. And so they need to stand out more. And that kind of like recursively makes it perform worse, I think. Because, the more detailed your models are, usually the less readable they are, but also the less performant your software is going to be. So all of that to be said, 3D graphics tend to be very inferior when it comes to readability and performance. However, there are some significant advantages that 3D has in general compared to 2D, and we're agnostic about whether this is for an RTS in this example, but it does apply to RTSs. You've definitely seen that for 2D, when it comes to like taking a model and rendering it into a sprite sheet and interpreting that sprite sheet, there are no transitions that you don't legislate within the model rendering process into that sprite sheet. So if it's not baked in, there's not going to be a transition. Hades is 2D sprite sheets. It's actually kind of the same thing. At least I think. I don't think there's any models in Hades. I think they're all sprite sheets, which might surprise some people if they remember things about Hades. And I could even be wrong about that. Feel free to fact check me if you want. But I believe I remember seeing that it was all sprite sheet. And that makes sense in some ways, but it also means that they had like thousands and thousands of sprite sheets for like the main character, for example. And that's fine, but that's sort of illustrating the point that I'm making here, is that if you want to have these elegant transitions from like going from start to stop and stop to start when it comes to walking or attacking, if you want to have these sorts of elegant transitions, then yeah, you absolutely need to legislate that. You have to hand animate them. You have to essentially design them yourself. When it comes to the 3D side of things, you can interpolate between animations. So you can basically interpolate between frames of an animation. And in fact, this is what Blender often does, for example, when we're animating, is we might not manually define every bone's location in every frame. In fact, most often we don't do that. And the result is that Blender sort of like solves for the difference between them. Say you have frame 1 and frame 3, and you've got like an arm that's like fully out on frame 1, and then it's kind of like pulled back maybe to wind up for a punch or something on frame 3, then on frame 2, it will automatically generate an in-between frame. And, usually that's good enough for a lot of particular bones, but you might have to take like, okay, maybe the elbow needs to be adjusted specifically, but like the fist doesn't need to be. And so then you preserve the interpolation of the fist specifically for that second frame. So the reason why I use that as an example is that interpolation will happen all the time in 3D games between actual animations. So instead of having to legislate, design a start to walk animation versus a walk versus just like having the animation of walking and having the animation of being idle, the game can kind of interpolate the leg positions and stuff such that it kind of automatically just starts to walk, and it's pretty natural. Now, sure, you could still design animation code that says, hey, we have a state called start walk, and then we have an animation that corresponds to that, and we only use the automatic interpolation part as like a fallback if there is no animation explicitly defined. But oftentimes, like, that animation data can be really beneficial because you can interpolate, for example, from like a facing angle. You can interpolate like looking a different angle. Say your unit had turned as part of its idle animation, and then you told it to move in the middle of its turn. It can elegantly sort of like adjust to it through interpolation instead of immediately snapping into whatever new frame it was looking at, which is what happens in 2D games. And you can see this all the time. If you like ever cancel an attack animation or something like that, or you have like your Maverick, for example, or your Huracan, who's like in the middle of attacking, so his arms are out for the Huracan, and for his Maverick, his gun is forward. If you order him to move, there's no like interpolation, there's no like subtlety. It oftentimes just will snap into the walk cycle. And that's another thing that 3D has really beneficial for it, is that you can interpolate like the arm position and the arm handling of it, so that like maybe the Huracan would put his guns or his nozzles down towards his sides. He would do so irrespective of what his legs were doing. You can do that separately. So you can have it so that the legs start to walk, even if they have to kind of snap or do it in a little bit of a less glorious way, because there's no turn delay in the game, or there's not very much turn delay. The legs might turn just like the torso and stuff will turn, but the legs would instantly be walking while the nozzles are sort of like, the arms are sort of falling down to the sides or to their sort of walk position, their natural rest position during the walk cycle. They can interpolate to do that instead of snapping to it. So that's one thing that I think is actually 3D graphics obviously have that's better than 2D, because you don't have to legislate it and you don't have to make like really big, expansive, unwieldy sprite sheets in the 2D side in order to emulate that sort of behavior. And even then, it'll just be an emulation. You probably won't catch all of the different snap potentials. So yeah, I think that's like one example. 3D obviously offers you the ability to zoom in and out or have different camera angles. That's something that you don't have in 2D. For like in-game cutscenes, that can be useful. I generally wouldn't recommend zooming in on any of these games because they tend to have very low poly, low resolution assets and textures and etc. And the reason for that is because it's an RTS and it can't really be that detailed for performance reasons, and it probably shouldn't be that detailed for readability reasons. So you don't really want to zoom in, and yet a lot of custom campaigns, a lot of official content as well, will just put your camera right in front of something that is incredibly low resolution, and it just destroys any immersion that you might have, for the sake of having an in-game cinematic experience. Yeah, I would probably prefer to just have the same view as the isometric angle at that point. Like, don't even bother. Or do an actual full rendered cutscene, which obviously is pretty challenging to do for the average person. And not necessarily for the average studio, mind you, although we rarely ever see them. So those are some of the pros and cons of 2D versus 3D. I think 2D still wins by a landslide in terms of function, but definitely there are certain aspects of 3D that can make the game look prettier. 3D doesn't have to be ugly in terms of readability and in terms of proportions and in terms of design. It doesn't have to be unreadable. It doesn't have to be unperformant, but it often is. And so really we don't have that many examples of super stellar, spectacular 2D games, but I think, I don't know if maybe some of like the younger generation will disagree with me, but I feel like even though we've dissed StarCraft's assets a lot, like the old Huracan graphic, the fire graphic, right? It's like it's very noisy and it's impossible to really see what's going on. I think like the old Dragoon model that we replaced with the Dracodon model, like the difference is night and day, not just because it turns, but because it actually looks like a thing and it's not just some weird abstract art thing that maybe I've attached some idea of or identity of from when I was a kid playing the game at 4 years old or whatever, and I didn't really understand what any of these shapes were. I think a lot of the terrain is also very impressionist and doesn't really necessarily look like a thing. And all of the Terran structures are a total disaster and don't make any sense. All of that to say, like, I think graphically, visually, StarCraft 1 has held up way better than StarCraft 2. And this is definitely not taking into account the remaster that busted lighting all over the place. But I'm just thinking about like the base game, right? So the 98 title, StarCraft, seems to have aged better in terms of visuals. I can't really imagine an argument that would make me think differently than StarCraft 2, which was ugly when it came out. So hopefully that answers your question, Myrian, and that will do it for that particular one. We've got 2 more questions to go. Moving swiftly on, we have the Shambler asking, how familiar are you with the grand strategy genre, and what are your opinions on it? So the grand strategy genre, the 4X genre, I imagine. I think the best experience I ever had with one of those was Imperium Galactica 2. I think the subtitle of it might have been Alliances or something. I can't remember. But Imperium Galactica 2 is pretty cool. I mostly liked the fact that it was like sci-fi, and I did like the whole like progressing through the research tree and eventually getting like battleships and stuff. And I remember like trying to speedrun getting like a particular class of bomb, I think, or something like. I don't know. I have like a lot of memories of that as like a early teenager, late or before teen, I guess tween or whatever you'd call that. I definitely have a stark memory of doing a lot of things like that or around that. So I guess that's probably my favorite of the title of that kind of game. I did try to play Stellaris. I never really got into it. I felt like it was a little bit too bogged down in terms of the stuff that wasn't for me. I feel like the other thing that I think Imperium Galactica 2 had going for it is that it did have you could start a custom game, which is basically like Stellaris, where you do whatever the fuck. You couldn't customize stuff to the degree of Stellaris, of course, but you had narratives, you had campaigns, and I don't think there were campaigns, like actual stories that you could follow through on, with like cutscenes and all this other stuff that as a kid I really appreciated about Imperium Galactica 2. I don't think you could really do that in Stellaris. The only other 4X game that I think I ever tried to play, it was some medieval one, but I honestly can't remember what it was. I know it wasn't any of the games like Hearts of Iron or by that developer, like the Mountain Blade stuff. I don't even think that qualifies, but that's the only thing that comes close to reminding me of what it was. But I never liked those kinds of games in general because, like, grand strategy to me would imply that there's many things that you can interact with to claim victory and all this other stuff. And in practice, a lot of the games decide to do it through kind of forcing you to interact with a lot of things that maybe you don't care about. At least that I felt pressured to constantly interact with like all of the things in Stellaris, and eventually just kind of checked out because it was like too much for me to give a shit about. So I fully recognize that I'm much more of an RTS type of guy, where your scale of the operation doesn't include things like morale and politics and population sizes, like to the degree of like, you know, your actual planetary population measurement and taxes and all this other stuff. You kind of had some systems with that in Imperium Galactica 2, but it's very much more on the lower impact side, where you didn't need to interact with those systems because the defaults were like good enough for like if you just were going to ignore that as a caveman, which I kind of played as, I suppose, in some ways. You could focus much more on like the military side and maybe on diplomacy and spying and stuff, which I thought was kind of neat. Like conversations. I remember really trying to like explore all the different things that you could potentially do with all the different empires. There's like the fucking, I can't remember what they're called, but there's like a race in Imperium Galactica 2. I think it begins with a T, and they have like, they kind of remind me of like, I don't know, like they look like scarabs almost or something. I can't remember exactly how to describe them, but they're weird. But I remember looking at them and thinking, dude, I want to play as those guys, and dude, I want to be allied with those guys. They look so cool, and I remember thinking that, and I remember loving all of the different icons they had for like the different ships and stuff. So, you know, I do remember also trying to play around with some of the actual fights where you like micromanaging the fights and stuff. But back then I didn't really appreciate that as much as I probably would enjoy it now. Like the land fights where you have like you land the tanks and you blow up the buildings. I loved building the cities up and trying to make them look good and also function properly, even though it really didn't matter where you put the structures generally. I remember building like trying to like space things out and like imagining what it was going to be there to be like that. I don't think that you could really do a lot of that stuff in Stellaris as much, but I also didn't play it very long, so I won't pretend that I'm super informed. I don't know, like basically there are things that I like that I could see being interesting that would be expansions of the RTS genre in terms of like adding the diplomacy factor and the spying and the subterfuge and the researching, which is like more macro scale research instead of like the, getting an ability on this one mission. There's some grand strategy elements I could see adding to an RTS and it being kind of interesting and compelling. I would not really want to do the Stellaris part or whatever, where there's like so many systems and it seems like it's really important to interact with most of them. I saw somebody playing Crusader Kings 2 and I felt the same way. It's like he would just be bombarded with like notices and warnings and like events that happen that he didn't really have control over. And it's just like, okay, he likes this for some reason, but I just look at that and I think, no, not my thing, not my cup of tea. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm at with that. But I feel like basically it just gets too complicated for me, and I get to a point where I'm not very interested in it, and I don't really want to continue fucking around with it. But I can see where there's some value in some of the systems, some of the stuff that I mentioned that I really liked about Imperium Galactica 2. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap with like base building and RTS, but there's also like I like some of the ideas within that. So hopefully that made some sense. I don't know if it would ever work in multiplayer. I feel like probably not, but in single player, sometimes it was pretty cool. Alexhandr asks, which 2D graphic style do you think is superior for games overall? And he lists sprites, pixel, vector, etc. So the thing for me is that I think it's definitely models rendered into sprite sheets, but I also think that you can probably make pixel artwork. I feel like since stuff like Metal Slug, that's the example that like Mesk uses a lot, and it's true. Like there's many games from the arcade era and from like the era that immediately followed arcades that they just blow modern pixel art out of the water, not just because the modern pixel art games use like a bunch of subpixel shit, which is just, not only is it not actually retro, but it's also just like, I think nauseating and not very good. But also they use it because they're not able to hack it in the other sector. Like I talked with Jonathan Blow about how like there's like a hypothesis that some people have in the server, like Meska's voiced it before, where we have like a lot of people in game design who are writers and they can't, they're games writers, but they couldn't hack it as Hollywood writers. So they come to games instead and they try to do like a worse job or whatever. And I kind of believe that, but I also kind of believe that same thing about like pixel artists, is that a lot of them couldn't hack it in the other sector. So they went to where their skills or lack thereof could be still utilized to create something that would actually make a game. So anyway, that is a hot take and a half, but I will have to just tell you that I think for side scrollers, maybe sprites make less sense and it should be pixels. Like I can definitely see like I could imagine a game like what do you call it? Shovel Knight. I think Shovel Knight was probably okay. I can't really remember what it looked like, to be honest, but I don't remember thinking that I hated the visuals the same way that I often hate a lot of the other pixel art. So at least it was acceptable to me at the time. And generally, I think when I see pixel art, unfortunately, I just associate it with a lot of low effort games, not just in the art department, but also in the design department, right? In terms of like, oh, you're doing this. Like I might still read the Steam page or whatever, but I need to get something that says, that counteracts that feeling of, oh man, this game is like, made because the guy wasn't very skilled. And so like it was made by someone who wasn't very skilled. Like I need a counterpoint to that hypothesis, basically. And I also don't really give a shit about graphics in the sense that like if it's a really good game, it's a fun game, then graphics aren't going to stop me from enjoying it. They are an added thing on top. The reason why I harp on graphics when I play like 3D games and stuff is, I'll harp on something if it's really easy to fix. But if it's like a style thing, or if it's like a thing where it's just the way that it works out to be is, how would you describe this? I think the reason why I harp on games in the modern day for having bad graphics is that usually it is actually pretty easy to fix. Like I was mentioning, when it comes to like the Five Nations stuff is what I was thinking of when I said that. But when it comes to like 3D games, it's a whole different ball game. Like usually these have enormous budgets and yet they can't configure anything properly. They have like all these obvious issues that you see as soon as you look at it, right? 2D is actually superior to 3D for that reason too. There's actually less things that can go totally wrong. I should tack that onto the Myrian question. But when it comes to like the graphics thing as an estimation of a product's quality, I think I'm not somebody who falls into that particular bucket of people that can't play a game if it looks bad. For me, I would just like the game to be readable, and I would like the game to be tolerable with its visuals. If it's a style that I don't necessarily jive with, that's whatever. I can still enjoy the game. And if it's also like, okay, the guy wasn't very skilled at the graphical part of it, I can sympathize with that because I'm much better at game design than I am at graphics in terms of like modeling and visuals and drawing and stuff like that. That's not my wheelhouse, but I do really genuinely appreciate when we get into territory where, okay, you've got like a developer or a couple of developers or whatever, and they don't necessarily have spectacular graphical chops, but they still made something that's like interesting and fun. That's fine. That's a little bit different. But if you're just talking about like in isolation, evaluating it based on its graphics, which style is better, I do think you would want to render out stuff. And that means you're not using pixel art. But I also can see the pixel art can work for other games, not RTS games. Don't make a pixel art RTS, please. Spare me. And we actually have a sudden fourth question here from Pr0totype, who asks, what were your favorite UMS maps, if any? Now, UMS stands for Use Map Settings. I talked a little bit about that at the start of the show, how we're starting to get more Use Map Settings stuff working. I know Biddy B was working on one earlier. He was actually messaging me about triggers. Spoiler. There's, I think, Pr0totype's working on like Bunker Command right now after making Can You Stop One Unit in CMBW. Really cool stuff. Really cool to see stuff like that. However, I am mostly very much somebody who is a fan of stuff that's like kind of more on the altered melee side, I guess. I didn't mind Phantom. I mostly liked the idea of maybe being able to like. I remember there was some stuff. I know God's Land was one example. I liked God's Land because, and you would obviously call it like Fraud's Land or something now. But I liked God's Land because you could imagine a world where somebody is like watching. It was really funny. You would have people who would be 1v1ing essentially, but it's like an FFA. And in that FFA, we had people who were, they would like bring units to the middle of the map, and those units would be killed, and that would like tally up like a sacrifice total. And I think it was like kind of biased towards Zerg if you were just going by raw numbers, because it would be something like. Obviously, like Zerg would just be spamming like Zethicors or Zerglings, if we're talking about vanilla StarCraft. So, whatever. I remember liking God's Land a lot, though. I remember making my own versions of it as well way back. I don't think I still have any of those versions, but maybe I do, honestly. Like, they might be like in my download folder from some hard drive anciently ago. But I like the idea of a lot of those things because it's just, I don't know, it's like role-playing opportunities in a way, but it's like in a way that's more about social stuff. Like I liked Mafia and StarCraft too, for the same reason, because it's like that social investigation stuff. I just like that kind of thing. And Mafia StarCraft 2 had a pretty robust set of options for that sort of thing, which was, it was always a crapshoot if you would get like some edgy Redditor or 4chan or whatever, but sometimes you would get some pretty funny people. And so, I ran my own Mafia game by forum way back. So I don't know if you could do that in StarCraft. That's kind of beyond the scope of the question, I guess. But most of my time with UMS was spent on defense maps, like Sunken Defense, stuff like that. I guess in that sense, Can You Stop One Fraud or whatever is kind of interesting for that reason. I don't know, like one unit, maybe not as exciting. I'd love to have something where, I remember like there's like photon cannon defense. There's all these different defense maps, and you'd like try to make mazes sometimes and stuff. It was really cool. Lurker defense, that's another one. I definitely played a lot of those maps. I definitely played a lot of maps where you would, like God's Land or even the general roleplay maps or whatever, spend a lot of time doing that stuff. So I guess that's probably it. Of the maps that I just said, I think defense maps and God's Land are probably like the best ones to look at if we were going to try to recreate stuff. But I'm sure there's a litany of options. I did play a little bit of cat and mouse, but I don't really know a lot of the details. So who bloody knows what those would turn out to be. But yeah, shout out to Pr0totype and Liblong and Biddy B and everybody else who's been working on some UMS stuff. I know DF has been helping people with trigger help and stuff recently. Very nice to see that side. And maybe just as we got the influx of competitive players with our tournament circuit, we might get an influx of UMS players or campaign players or whatever with all of the content that we're making that isn't strictly competitive in nature. And that's pretty cool. And with that, we have reached the end of this episode of Pr0totype. Factitious. That's the first time I said the name of the episode, but I might as well because it's in big old letters since it's such a short and to the point title compared to some of the other ones we've had. I hope you have enjoyed this particular episode of Prototype. I hope you are excited for the factions, excited for the UMS, and of course excited for the inevitable return of tournaments and such. I'm excited for Mapcrap, and I'm excited. I'm very happy with the work that I did yesterday, where I had that really long stream, and before that I finished the work on the Anad's Greatsword layout, and now I can really focus on like the script and stuff like that. We will have some more supercuts coming this week as well, so check those out when they arrive. And like I mentioned, we'll have some sort of crow's nest somewhere, somehow, some way, and I very much look forward to seeing that in action as well. All right, GG boys, we'll talk soon.